Good afternoon, everybody. Name of my session is Demolishing the Monolith. Think again. So the question is whether you can demonolith a monolith. Now, monoliths are usually that legacy app that has existed in your organization for years, decades, who knows how long. It can be in any number of technologies. And it's gotten to the point where it's old, right? And we need to do something with it. Now, nobody wants to start over from scratch. So the thought is, well, we'll open up the monolith, we'll pull things out piece by piece, and before too long, we've migrated it into a new technology-based, new architecture, whatever you decide is important, and the existing monolith just kind of shrivels up, blows away. But there's problems with that. For example, you've got a unified, and it's a stateful UI. You might only have internal messaging, no way to talk to the outside world. You might have custom process management. So now once these problems start adding up, you're like, this isn't going to work. This is never going to happen. And does that mean? I used to believe that, in fact, you would be able to kind of extract piece by piece. So I used to believe you actually could do this, that little by little you'd pull out the pieces, microservices, right? Hot rage, we'd make a bunch of microservices, we'd call them. And the more I thought about it, the problems just don't add up. The effort doesn't add up. And friends and peers tend to agree. It doesn't work. They've tried it, they've failed, they've tried to plan for it. And so I tend to believe it's a fairy tale that you can actually do this. And maybe this is an Americanism, it's putting lipstick on a pig. The benefits you're looking for are not achieved. The problems you're trying to solve, especially technical, don't occur. The return on investments aren't there. And ultimately, it doesn't happen. I want to use a real-world example. This is the Palace of Westminster, seat of British government. It has problems. It was built in 1840. And other than repairs done after World War II, they really haven't done a lot with the infrastructure. Yes, they've added bathrooms for female MPs. Yes, they've added networking and cables and television, telephones and things like that. But for the most part, it's really like it has been for over 100 years. And in fact, they had a Brexit discussion which was halted because a pipe burst in the ceiling and flooded one of the chambers. So they've got a problem. They don't want to be Notre Dame in Paris. They want to solve the problem, but it's going to be really expensive. And they've come up with 3 plans. One is the common stays in place, which means all the work that you're doing to fix the problems happen while the business of governments continues. Nobody leaves, you work around everybody. The estimate is 46 to 76 years. I'm dead. No question about it. If they ever complete it, I'm dead. Now another option is what they call a partial decant, which means one body leaves, House of Commons is the most likely, they go elsewhere. They fix the House of Commons. Then the House of Lords moves to the House of Commons. They fix the House of Lords. Everybody moves back. They're all happy. A little better, 26 to 43 years. I'm not dead. I'm probably senile. And finally is everybody leaves. And the construction goes on, the reconstruction goes on, totally unimpeded. It still is a long time. Still is a lot of money. But it might actually get done. The problem that they have here is you've got a whole generation and probably 2 of members of parliament who never served in the seat of British government. Okay, so nobody wins. I think they picked the full decant, but they keep changing their minds. They keep trying to figure out what to do, and they keep kicking the can down the road. This sounds like tech debt? Yes. So a little bit about me. I work at a company called DataSite. They are a software as a service company doing merger and acquisition software. If my accent doesn't give it away, I'm from the United States. Light green is Minnesota, where I'm from. Wonderful summers, miserable potential winters. You know, we're talking 250, 290 centimeters of snow some winters. My wife and I love travel, especially international travel. Those are the places that I've been to post-pandemic. And now I get to add Lithuania. That is our COVID kitty, who is reading some architectural guardrails and guidelines that I was working on. He has actually heard this speech more than any known person. Very little feedback, unfortunately. And my name in Russian, Polish, and Czech, Sosna, means pine tree. Google Translate says Lithuanian as well. I've had a Lithuanian person say, I've never heard that term, but it is pine tree in many other languages. So, quick disclaimer. These are my views. Don't necessarily represent that of my employer. except my employer went through the same challenges and tried the same thing that we're going to discuss before I even got there. And these are based on my experiences. Your experiences are going to be different. What you conclude is going to be different. I guarantee you, you're not going to agree with me 100% of the time. There's a million ways to write hello world, all of them right, all of them wrong. And I'm not trying to tell you what to do. I'm just trying to give you some context. So if you're actually told you're demonolithing, you might have some things to talk about with your team, your leaders, things like that. Now, if you're looking for just a quick statement, what do I think about demonolithing? Don't do it. If that's all you're looking for, you can leave now, go to another session. But that's going to be like, thank you, end of talk. 4 basic ideas that we're going to go through. Define what makes your application monolithic. We're going to identify some of the surprises you're going to find. Now, inevitably, leaders love buzzwords. They might not know their technology, but they know the buzzword demonolith. You might be asked. We will talk a little bit about what you may do, how you may approach it. And then finally, we'll do Q&A as time permits, final comments, stuff like that. So, let's talk about define. Over lunch with a friend about 18 months ago, which was the triggering event for this talk, my friend said, after 10 years, we're almost demonolithing our business-critical app. Okay, at what point were you maintaining 2 completely identical functionality in 2 completely different code bases? Or you had to tell product, yeah, you're not going to get that because you're at a state where it was just a mess. At what point did this actually become a rewrite? And he'll admit, yeah, it was basically a rewrite. It was a rewrite called demonolithing because it was easier to sell politically. And we're talking, this is a senior leader. But at the end of the day, they took their app and they rewrote it from scratch. And it took them 10 years, which I'm going to argue is not something where most of us are going to be given time for. Now, if you're in the Java world, you're very familiar with Java Developer Kit. JDK. We work with it every day. We complain about it every day. We earn our living with it every day. And one major demonolithing they did was Jigsaw, modularization of the JDK. First mentioned in June 2005. Didn't really get going until August 2008. It was in Java 7, that got moved to Java 8. At some point, Oracle took a break because they had some major security issues they wanted to address and didn't work on it for a while. Then it got moved to Java 9. Finally released in Java 9 in September 2017. 12 plus years after initially defining what you wanted to do. And they did a really good job because for the most part, those of us who are dealing with the JDK weren't affected. What worked before in 8 worked in 9. Many of us don't even use modules, and they had to touch everything. Source trees, build process, introduce new tools. But it took them 12 years. And most of us aren't going to be given 12 years. Many of our companies would be out of business if it took us this long. Fortunately, Oracle has the money. My friend had 10 years, probably because his company was bought and sold 2 or 3 times in that. So every time he got to reset. Nobody knew what he was doing. He got to re-explain it. New context. Most of us are not going to be given this time. Most of us do not have leaders with that level of patience. Now, that's not saying that everything is a monolith. Firmware, things that have to run as close to possible to the hardware, operating system, database servers, storage, those are going to be big code bases. They're going to be complicated code bases. It doesn't mean it's a monolith. Just because it's big and large doesn't mean it's a monolith. If you've ever looked at the FreeBSD source code, it's really well done. I've looked at Linux. I'm not as familiar with it. The other thing you have are applications that we install on our MacBooks, Chromebooks, laptops, what have you. It doesn't make sense to have a microservice-based approach to OpenOffice because there's just too many pieces to install. Too many ways that a user can go in and tweak something and suddenly break everything, right? It's going to be miserable to install. It's going to be miserable to maintain. So you do have large code bases that are legitimately complex, legitimately difficult to understand. Monoliths are difficult to understand for all the wrong reasons. Now, Simon Brown kind of addressed this morning in his talk on software architecture, his 5 points on software architecture, design first, then code to design. And that used to be, back in the past, a lot of upfront design. Now he advocates, design those expensive decisions that you need to make that are going to be expensive to change later, whether that's technology stack or database, what have you. The problem is a monolith was never designed to be in the modern world. Its starting points were what was common back then, whether that's a fat app that runs on a client server mentality, MVC, what have you, to force it into a new, today's architecture, whatever you define that as, however, whatever's important to you, the monolith wasn't designed for it. So are you going to like shave off the edges of a square to put it into a round hole? Because that's the only way it's going to work, and it's never going to be a good fit. And that's part of the problem that I think we're dealing with here. So no two monoliths are identical, but there are some commonalities. You're probably going to recognize some of these in some of your own applications. First, it's legacy. Now, you might not be able to call it legacy because those who work on it are going to be insulted. It's got to be the one who works, Mo and Myra work on it. But you know it's legacy. It feels legacy. The code looks legacy. The user interface is old. It just feels old. It's usually large. It's a large code base. It's a large data model. It's a large build process. It's a large user interface. Whatever you look at, whatever metric is important to you, it's large. And likely it's a single one. It's not that it's just a large code base. It's probably a single code base, maybe with one repo, with everything in it. It's not that it's a single data model. It's a database schema with 500, 600, 700 tables in it. And yes, I have seen those. It's not a large build process. It's a single build process and a single deploy process. And if anything goes wrong, you start over from scratch. Your deploy could take hours. 3 hours in, and I've seen this, one little thing fails, there is no way to do anything but go back to the beginning. And it's complex. We kind of talked about it before. It's complex, but for all the wrong reasons. It has dead code that's never been removed. It's got interfaces that were defined with good intention but not ever used. It's got code that's just expanded. I've seen a single case of like 24, 36 lines, and you did the git blame, and there was like 84 changes on it. Because everybody had their change to their business rules, they just added to the conditional. No breaking things up. And that complexity means high onboarding costs. The next time somebody joins the team, does it take 3 months, 6 months, longer for them to actually be able to do anything? OMD, Fickle, jumping ahead of myself. From a developer standpoint, you try and install it on your desktop, your laptop to get working. You're an engineer, right? You find the Confluence pages, the SharePoint pages, they don't probably match, but you try and put it together and you spend a week or two saying, I should be able to do this. And you fail miserably. And you finally bring over Teresa and say, Teresa, can you help me? And she just pushes you aside, gets to your keyboard, does some magic, it works. And she's like, don't ask. It works. Just move forward with life. OMD, Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark. That's a 1990s electronica band. It's also those things you do under the cover of darkness that you hope your leaders don't find out just to keep the app going. It can be something simple like you remove referential integrity because you can't figure out the data quality issues, or you maybe remove an index or add indexes. It might be that you have this magical job that clears out some directory of cached files or something. What you do is not anything you're proud of. It's not anything that you want on your resume, but it's the only way to keep the app working. I worked with a retailer once, and they were doing their first web implementation of their store. They couldn't figure out why it kept dying. Christmas is coming up, big time sales. And they just did like 15 or 20 things that they couldn't explain why they did it, what it meant, and it worked. They stayed up during Christmas. That's OMD for you. My friend calls this the infinite blast radius. Simon actually mentioned this as well this morning. You make a change over here, you've checked the code references, and you're like, okay, I can make this change. Nobody's going to notice. It's small, it's contained. And you get over here and something breaks. And it usually breaks in production. It's not nice enough or kind enough to break in development or test or whatever. It breaks in production, and you can't explain it. The code references don't show anything that would be relevant, and yet it does. It's inconsistent. Now, from a user's perspective, it's inconsistent UI. It's a UI that might look 3 different ways because the company had 3 different standards of what was important in their UI. It might be the terminology is different. In medical software, is it a patient? Is it a subject? What is it? And different terms means that the user has to say, okay, I'm in this part of the application, they're going to call it a patient. Now us, when we look at it from an engineering technical standpoint, we see completely different coding styles, duplicative technologies being used to do the same thing. Because as things progress, we brought in this technology, we brought in this coding paradigm, or somebody likes something that, and she or he are no longer with the company. It's just inconsistent. And finally, it's scary. Any way you look at it, you don't want to get involved. My example here is we had a class, single method, 3,400 lines long. Now, it started off at 1,800 lines, and somebody thought that was good, but it had grown to 3,400 lines, and now suddenly it can't be instrumented by Sonar. This is Java, and this is part of our build process. It's not instrumentable. So I go to Tony, who has been maintaining this against his will for years. And I said, Tony, we got to do something. He's like, no. What do you mean? No, we can't build it. He's like, well, we don't have any documentation. Okay. We don't have any business rules. We don't have any tests. If we break this, this is billing. I said, it's broken. We got to do something. He is shaking because he is scared to do anything because he doesn't want to be the one that breaks it. Most of us are dealing with web apps in here. That's, might be mobile, but by and large, we're dealing with web apps. We're front-end developers, back-end developers, DevOps, things like that. A lot of what I'm going to talk about will drive towards software as a service. There's a lot of that where you are a provider of software to others. Some of it might apply to people who are larger internal companies. But the big question is, why is this so hard? And it's really hard because of the non-functional requirements. Monoliths often weren't created or kept up to date with different scaling models, whatever the case is. We all are struggling how to deal with it, and the monoliths just make it all the worst. So let's look at what a monolith really is. That's our first release. It's clean, it's small, it's compact, it does what it's supposed to. It's documented, it's testable. Everything we wanted in the architecture is there. We're really happy. Unfortunately, it's pretty minimal functionality. It's a great starting point, but we've got to do a next release. Okay, it's larger. It's a little frayed in a few areas, but by and large, I can understand what's there. I can tie it back to the architecture. There's a few things I'm not completely happy with, but it works well. And now product gets excited, or your business analysts get excited, like, okay, let's do this and this and this and this. Oops. Now, some people in the demonolithing environment, the demonolithing idea would say, well, we'll clean that up wire by wire. We'll pull out a wire and clean it up, and before too long, we can make sense of it. But that doesn't even talk about the configurations on the network device. Those are probably just as ugly. So again, doubtful that you can actually fix it without breaking something else. Now, I would say, and this is why I'm talking, you start over. Give me some new network devices, let me configure them, we'll fail over at some point. I'll redo those and I've got my backup. But many monoliths resemble that underneath the sheets. Okay, now let's talk about some of the things you're going to find inside. Some of the things you're aware of, some of it you're not aware of. Tenancy. Now, this is an architectural diagram for I think it was Danish dormitory. And while everybody has their own bedroom and their own bathroom and shower and things like that, a lot of shared spaces here. You've got shared kitchen, shared study, shared terrace. Doesn't even mention the shared infrastructure, electricity, heating, air conditioning, networking, cable, whatever it is. And the more you share, the expense of all of these things, the lower it is on a per person basis. Same in software, right? If we're able to share with multi-tenant abilities, we're going to have a lot lower expenses overall for the infrastructure. And unfortunately, the monoliths weren't designed that way. Monoliths are often single tenant. And as a single tenant, means you have an instance for everybody that you might be running. So this is a monolith I know about. It is not, the customer is not named X, but you have customer X who has the monolith X, who has a database X, YYY, ZZZ, blah, blah, blah. The databases might be shared on a common server with different database instances or different partitions or whatever, but by and large, everybody has their own everything. Everybody is scaled up to the maximum that you need because at any given time, your monolith might need 5x the resources to do end-of-month processing. So at the shop that I was at, we were like, okay, it's time to pull out our first service. We're going to extract a service and put it into the monolith, and I said, okay, we're going to make this monolith multi-tenant, right? No, 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 too big of a step. We'll make the service single tenant like this. So now there's a service W, service X, service Y, service Z. Okay, you've only got 4 monoliths here. What happens if you've got 5,000? Or in this case, they actually had like 25,000. And what if you have 50 services apiece? I think that's 12.5 million. I did the numbers earlier. 12.5 million individual services that you're deploying, maintaining, administrating, da-da-da-da-da. And they're like, yeah, we're going to go this route. And it wasn't until the cloud ops team said, you can do that. You will bankrupt the company, but that's your choice. We got stopped. Let's talk about the data aspect of it. Now, most monoliths, because this is what we did back in the day, it's a relational data model. Okay. This is kind of a very high-level, incomplete data model for a tech conference system, conference like we're at today. The green is the people, the person who is submitting a presentation, presenting it, reviewing the presentation, or attending, as you guys are. The blue is about what are the submissions, what are the, which ones have been approved, what's the feedback. The pink is the schedule, essentially. So let's say we're going to pull out our submissions and our reviews in our first microservices. What's that mean? Well, microservices usually have dedicated storage, dedicated persistence. So if I pull them out, I suddenly got a hole in my data model. What happens to those multi-table SQL statements or multi-table object-oriented OOM solutions that rely on those tables being populated? Well, now you're going to have to change and go out and call the microservice, bring back the data, assemble a response. Very doable, but this is just 2 out of 10 or 11, however many tables. What happens when you've got 125 of your 500 tables that are now covered by a service? You're going to constantly playing whack-a-mole, like, oh, this table's no longer there, I've got to go to the service. Introducing a lot of work on the monolith and a lot of work just keeping the data right. And calling out to the services to assemble a response, it's doable. I mean, my company, that's all we do is microservices all over the place. We call the 2 or 3 we need, assemble a response. But in a monolith, you've got this data hanging around that's going to be a problem. How much work is it going to be to get this set up into one place? Now let's talk about domains. Initially, your domains have well-defined boundaries, responsibilities, functionalities. Over time, your subject matter experts move on. Different companies, different teams, who knows what. Your engineers got promoted to being managers. Okay, so what's that going to mean for your domain model? Again, a technical service, a technical conference, high-level domain model, and I've got a green person domain. So the conference has decided they're going to be pet-friendly. I assume that means your dog. I don't think I'm bringing my cat. I hope you're not bringing your goat or llama. But we're going to be pet-friendly. And they announce it to the world before talking to the engineers. And the engineers say, we've already got a bunch of work. We don't have time to spin up a new domain. And the leaders say, well, you got to do something because we've already promised it. People are bringing their pets, and you need to know what the pets are, the pets' names, things like that. So the engineers whiteboard a solution, and they come up with, let's just make a person pets. Let's kind of bastardize that person, add a few optional properties, and a relational, self-related instance, and I can have my pet owned by me. What's the problem here? First off, you know that a pet's going to be presenting before too long, or a pet's going to submit a session. Hopefully the pet doesn't own the person, but it's a data problem. You know your engineers are going to be cleaning that up for most of the conference. More importantly for this talk, as you start demonolithing, what do you do about that domain? You've got essentially 2 domains within one. How do you extract half that concept? How do you, it becomes really difficult because the domain discipline has kind of gone overboard as you've moved on. Now, every application known to man has technical shortcomings. If you're not seeing it, you're not looking. Monoliths have a lot more. Let's just go to say that. Now, to be clear, technical shortcomings aren't design limitations. They're not feature debt. These are just focusing on the technology. Is your framework old, insecure, no longer supported? Or is it a homegrown internal framework? That's probably the worst, because you're going to go interview somebody, And Sally's going to say, what's your framework that you use? And she's expecting to hear Java, JEE. She's expecting to hear Quarkus or Spring Boot or whatever in the Java framework area. And you're going to say, Flubber. And I'm not going to explain what Flubber is. I had a nice long story I used in previous talks. But the end of the game is she's just going to smile at you, leave the interview, and ghost you and never hear from you again. Because she doesn't want to work on Flubber. She wants to work on something that's going to increase her skill set and increase her marketability. But many companies back in the day created their own frameworks. Now raise your hands, if you're not too embarrassed, how many people have worked on an application or implemented this where your user authentication is actually stored in your transactional database? Lots of hands. Guess what? You did that in the 90s, you don't do that today. You use an IDP. You delegate to a trusted authority to make sure you know who it is. IDPs might not have existed when the monolith was first created. It might not have been thought of as being important. It's really important today. Well, if you try and demonolith, and now I've got a service that is using an IDP, but the monolith isn't, do I have to, and some people have scraped together and got part of the IDP working, but they still often have a lot of their own authentication. You can't do that anymore. It's insecure. Your security team should scream at you. Tech debt. There are complete sessions on tech debt, probably at this conference, at any conference, because it's a problem that we all deal with. Let's just say that the monolith often has more tech debt than other problems. And those tech debt problems may need to be addressed before you demonolith. Does it really make a lot of sense to satisfy the tech debt problems before you actually go ahead and try and extract, let's say, a service or a front end or whatever the case is? Test coverage. Over time, even if the monolith started with great test coverage on all of the use cases and you could trust it to do what it needed to, over time that went away. So what does this mean when you demonolith? I pull out a service. How do I test the service? Do I have to write the test for the monolith before I write the tests that go for that service? Seems like a wasted effort. How do I know, though, that the service is doing what it's expected? Or do I want the service to do what was expected? So this opens up a whole can of worms. And finally, there's these things. You have no idea where that came from. You have no idea what it's doing. You have no idea how it's wired in. You have no idea what happens when you remove it. But it's there. Somebody's got to figure that out. This was from a real estate photo. This was a legitimate real estate photo. But yet, that's there. And there's a whole bunch of other things that you're going to try and deal with, right? How do you deal with all of those things and actually make sense of it to work through demonolithing? Now, if you are a software as a service company, you might have sold your solution on-prem in the beginning of time. And that was a solution, right? We all hosted our own applications. Those applications were sold, deployed, run locally on an internet, maybe through VPN. That really introduces some problems in the demonolithing exercise. I could go and talk about this for 25, 30 minutes. I wrote a blog about it. But needless to say, if you've got an on-prem customer, especially if it's a Fortune 500 customer who can pull you around and say, yeah, no, you're not doing anything. We're still going to maintain it on site. You're going to have some real issues. And I talk about potential approaches, but it could be a deal breaker. I don't think any of us disagrees with this. This guy is the one he's a Dutch programmer physicist. He wrote PostFix. As the code base increases, it becomes more and more time consuming to maintain. Monoliths are that much worse. I have seen certain teams on a project put 35 to 50% of their next sprint time in unstructured bug fixes, unstructured planning. That's a problem. That's a huge part of the sprint. I don't care if it's a 1 week, 2 week, 4 week sprint. 50% spent on something you don't know is going to happen, but you know you're going to be hit by, can be a problem. This next section, I'm going to just fly through because I'm not, as I talk it through, when I practice in front of my cat, it wasn't clear that it was coming across. And the reason is the changes that your organization might have to deal with as you demonolith or as you bring in new ways of doing business, new ways of doing programming, frameworks, things like that. Every organization is going to be different. And so some of this may apply and not apply to you. I'm just going to fly through it. But you might be changing technologies, your design paradigm, processes, the skills you require may be different. Maybe it's API first, micro front ends, definitely talking about needing to go asynchronous. And then even for the other parts of the organization, can HR actually get resources for you if you've decided to change technologies? And I guess this applies whether you are demonolithing or starting from scratch. You might be limited on how much you can actually change. If you can't hire, train, contract resources, well, what can you do? Product is going to have to figure out how they represent the new world. Finance has to figure out. So these are all, as I talked it through to myself, it was like, this is really specific to your situation. It's you knowing your organization about how much pain and change they can actually handle. So that's your monolith, right? That's what's there today. That's the things that you're probably being asked to look at. Let's talk about leadership, who have just heard the word demonolith, jumped all over it, buzzword bingo. What do we do? I think there's plenty of reasons not to demonolith. I think you can make a compelling argument. It's tough, but I think you can make it. If you demonolith a monolith, at the end of the day, you've done like for like. And what I mean by that is the functionality you had before is primarily the functionality you have afterwards. Very little benefit to the customer from a functionality standpoint. If you start over and you greenfield it, guess what? You actually have a chance to re-envision the product, do new things. What's coming up on the horizon? Oftentimes, demonolithing exercises assume you're going to stay with the same basic technology stack. Whether it's the right technology stack or not is a different question. You might have picked .NET, you want to go Python. You might have picked, pick a different framework. You were Quarkus, you want to go Spring Boot in the Java world. You have a chance to re-envision your technology stack, assuming your organization can fund it and resource it and things like that. But if you just take a demonolith and you keep the same technology, you're probably bringing over the same technology problems from the monolith to the demonolith. Security has often been tacked onto the side, grudgingly, to your monolith. Let's build it in from the get-go. Let's do things like least privilege, separation of duties, failing security, whatever your security team thinks is important. Monoliths often weren't as secure because guess what? They were run internally or it just wasn't seen as important. We now know in today's world it's very important. So you get to think about security from the ground up, build it in at the base, not add it in afterwards. And finally, I even think that from a financial perspective, you probably can make an argument that it would be better to start over than actually go ahead and keep trying to demonolith. What I'm hearing from friends, what I believe happens is you make an effort to demonolith and it's a throwaway effort. You waste a year, 2 years. That's a loss of product, that's a loss in marketing, that's a loss in sales potentially for no gain, and then you have to figure out where to pick up the pieces. It might be that in 3 to 5 years, you're able to get new customers on, so initially it's a very upfront expense. But later, especially if you do things like multi-tenancy, your infrastructure costs go way down. Your performance goes way up, hopefully. Your ability to innovate with product goes up because you've done things with a more modern, more flexible architecture than what you had. Now that said, greenfield doesn't mean it's going to be smooth. It's going to be rocky. There's a lot of things here that you've got to discuss and deal with, and it's going to be very painful. Most people will say you shouldn't start software over, right? The whole premise of my talk is saying, yeah, we're going to start over. And Joel on Software, if you've ever read his blog, he had something 10 or 15 years ago saying, don't start over. And there's definitely reasons that starting over does cause problems. The Berlin-Brandenburg Airport, it opened, was it 9 or 11 years after they initially thought it was going to open? It opened in 2020, when it was supposed to open in 2012 or 2011. It was planned since German reunification. And that's kind of the mess you can get into if you aren't careful. That said, there are still examples in the real world. The most recent that I read about was Bind, which is a DHCP server on Unix-like systems. Did that go backwards? Yes, it did. So, let's talk about how we might approach being asked to do demonolithing. And I think initially you've got to understand what you're dealing with. You've got to understand the current state, the functionality, the technology, the implementation. You've got to dig in a lot deeper than perhaps you've had to in the past. Even if you've been there from the beginning, there's that toilet hanging up, or that washing machine over the toilet. You need to understand everything there. You need to understand what product is willing to do, where product is trying to take your company. And most importantly, you've got to understand your organization's willingness to accept change. Can your leaders keep eyes on the ball and actually deliver? So you're going to have to dig in. You're going to have to do some research, understand what you're dealing with here. You don't want to be in the news. Southwest Airlines, I don't know who's all heard about it. They're a beloved airline in the US. They're quirky. They don't have change fees. They don't have baggage fees. They used to not even let you select a seat. By those who fly Southwest, they're loved. Until 2022, December 2022, bad weather in the US caused flights to be canceled all over the place. Most airlines were up within a day or so. Southwest wasn't up for 6 or 7 days because their rescheduling software, which hadn't been maintained since like early 80s, early 90s, something like that, couldn't handle the complexity. They put in all the variables and say, okay, reschedule for me, and the software say, can't. And because it's the holiday season, there is no spare capacity on any airline, and their passengers are stuck at airports. The CEO had to make a public apology, appear in front of Congress, say it's not going to happen again, say we're going to invest in technology, but they still paid $750 million to solve this problem. You don't want to be that. You don't want to be in the news. To avoid that, you might be able to find a triggering event in your investigation that actually shows you what you might be running into. Now you get to start planning. What are you going to do? What's important to your organization? What is the problem statement? Do you have a problem statement? Can you make a problem statement? You're going to try and plan how this is going to transpire. You're going to try and figure out what order you're going to do things in. Are we going to change technology stacks? Are we going to go to an API first approach? What does that mean for the UI? And you're going to do this whether you quote unquote demonolith or whether you start over. You're going to have to come up with a plan that you can sell to the leaders. And I don't know what that means to you. Do you need to have a detailed roadmap? Which is kind of a farce because we know that any software roadmap is only good as long as the paper it's printed on or the digital bytes it's printed with. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to come up with something because you're going to have to sell this to the organization. One of the things you should be doing is looking at outside sources. Seeing things like what ThoughtWorks radar is, technical radar is telling us. What is some of the developer surveys telling us. Because of course, internally, leaders never believe a senior leader. They want to hear others are doing it as well. They're loath to just do it on their own. So there are plenty of resources online that will tell you what happens. You're going to have to socialize it. You're going to have to find allies because there's no way that you're going to do this on your own. Implementation or anything. You want allies who can help sell your message, help explain what you're doing to others, maybe tell the story in a different way. The real question is who do you socialize with? Is this technology leadership? Is this product? Is this the C-level? Is this everybody? But ultimately, you find an ally who says, I get it. I know what you're doing, and I'm able to understand what this means to the organization, how it benefits the organization, things like that. One of the things with socializing it is you're going to get feedback. And that feedback gets rolled into your story so that when you get in front of important people, C-levels, you have a better story. And then finally, you get to present this. You get to tell the leaders what you think you should do. The problem with leaders are they tend to be risk averse. They want evolutionary over revolutionary. Demonolithing could be conceived as a evolutionary step, but not really, right? It's going to be revolutionary. Starting over is going to be revolutionary. But they prefer incremental steps over massive jumps. They also don't want to take risks because it could impede their getting their bonus at the end of the year, right? They don't want to be the one let out the door when something fails. And it's also unlikely when you get in front of them that what you tell them is going to go unscathed. You're going to get questions thrown at you that you hadn't thought about. You're going to get ideas that might not match yours, and you're going to have to tap dance to get the story out. The return on investment that you think you're going to get probably isn't there. So you're guaranteed to get a lot of pushback from leadership, unless your leadership is really enlightened and just say, yep, we get it. most leaderships are going to really push on this, and they're not going to want a 10-year roadmap. They're not going to want to hear starting over, right? Nobody likes to hear, well, we get to start over. Hopefully you come out of this meeting and you've got some way to move forward. You've agreed on some ways to address it. You might have some proof of concepts that you can move forward with. Or you might not get what you want at all, and that's going to be a difficult thing to do. Ultimately, you get to choose your path afterwards. You might walk out of that meeting feeling like, it's going to be tough, but I think I can do it. I think we can deliver. Or you might walk out and say, oh my God, this is going nowhere fast. I think, again, demonolithing, I don't think is an option. And truthfully, probably starting over from scratch is not an option either. There's probably that partial decant solution where you explore new ways of doing things and try and implement that and then call it from the... There's an in-between. So let's wrap this up. So before I gave this talk in 2023, I asked ChatGPT, hey, why can't you demonolith a monolith? Paragraph 3, technically possible, time-consuming and expensive, especially for large and complex applications, which is what I described. It may be more practical to rebuild the application. And I'm like, woohoo! And I wrote my presentation before I asked, and it basically agrees with me. ChatGPT 2024 basically agrees. A lot more bullet points and trying to figure out cultural resistance. We kind of talked about that. But at the end of the day, basically the same. It might not be impossible to demonolith. It could be daunting. Well-planned, incremental approach coupled with strong, I can't read without my glasses, team buy-in and resource allocation. Well, guess what? This is where your leaders come in. Can your leaders keep the eyes on the ball? Can they actually push off distractions from other leaders saying, this is costing too much time and this is too expensive? To get anywhere, you're going to have strong leadership. Does your organization have that? That's for you to decide. Ultimately, this isn't going to end the way you think. That's why I don't think it's the start from scratch or demonolith. You're probably in between where you're, let's say, going to bring in a third-party app that does document management, and you're going to somehow take the document management in your existing monolith and call it to manage it. You're going to create some of your first microservices for the organization, not necessarily just for the app, and you're going to try and figure out how to code it. And I've seen those both succeed and fail as well. No matter what you do, you're going to be wrong. No matter what you do, you're going to be blamed. It's a tough sell. Now, when my company decided to do that, it had buy-in all the way up to the CEO. The CEO got it. He's not technical, but he understood the limitations of the existing monolith. He understood the effort that they tried to demonolith, and the first few steps were not good. And they said, we're going to do it. And they had strong leadership. The CTO at the time told the story, told it positively, kept everybody grounded. And today, my application is a multi-microservices, hundreds of micro front ends, and it works. It's the first place I've seen it work, but they started over. Wrap up. What do I have here? There's some supporting links. I've got at the end. This is probably more important. That QR code will take you to the presentation. Has everything in it with more detail than you probably want to know. And at 44 minutes, I am right on time. Thank you very much for your time. I hope this was helpful. Thanks.